All right, so this is pretty cool, but the one thing that's kind of bumming me out at the moment is that everything is very even, right? Our squares are all the same size, they're all the same shape, which makes sense because we've been working with just a regular cube at this point. But I think we can make this a little bit more interesting. So I want to go through a process of building a tool that we can use to kind of break up some of these shapes. And before we do that, I want to dig into just a little bit of theory. So here we have just a regular grid, right? It's just a 3x3 grid. But ideally what we would like is something that has a little bit more detail to it, something that kind of breaks up those lines and maybe gives us some more interesting shapes, right? Something that takes this from being a regular grid and makes it something a little bit more interesting. The process that we're going to follow is essentially this. We're going to take our regular grid of shapes and we're going to subdivide it a handful of times. So we can subdivide it once or twice or 3 times or whatever. And we're going to get down to a point where we have a little bit more detail built into all of these squares that make up our cube. And then we're going to use noise. We're going to use another one of the noises that came from Cinema 4D, the more detailed noise, the noise on some of the tighter grids. And we're going to use that noise to actually break up that shape a little bit. So we're going to transfer that noise onto our newly subdivided squares, and we're going to use that noise to kind of define some new irregular polygon shapes, which is going to be really cool. But there is another layer of detail that we can add to this, right? Because what we have in Houdini doesn't necessarily look like a nice even grid. It actually looks kind of like these things, right? Where we have these sort of little islands of groups of polygons. And we can actually treat each of these differently, which can add a whole other layer of detail and interest to this. So if we think about treating each of these as a separate component of connected polygons, and we end up sort of subdividing them in a different way. So here we're subdividing by 1, here some of them are subdivided by 2, and here even a couple less are subdivided by 3. So we can even get more interesting detail and variety out of this. Before we even get into subdivision, we need to tell Houdini that each of these groups of connected polygons should be treated separately. It should be treated as its own unit, and it should be processed individually rather than processing everything as a whole. We want to process them as their own pieces. We need to tell Houdini first that these are individual units to be considered. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use what's called a for loop in order to actually run a very simple operation on each of these little islands separately.